Willpower that the organizers offered me wine and Krispy Kreme donuts. So I actually in a willpower experiment right now, and someone's back there recording. So I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about the science of willpower. I think many of us are used to thinking of science as a source of solutions for our problems, including willpower challenges. Maybe we hope that science will come up with some sort of drug or pill that will allow us to eat Krispy Kremes endlessly and never gain weight. Or maybe there'll be some new technology that will help us finally get everything on our to-do list done. The thing that I love most about science, including the science of willpower, is how it can change the way we think about ourselves and our struggles. And so I hope to share some of that with you today, including 5 of the most common myths or misunderstandings that we have about willpower, what science is teaching us that is a little bit different than what we commonly think, and how rethinking willpower can actually help you achieve your goals or make an important change. And I want to start with one of my favorite stories from the history of the science of willpower. This rat was, if this rat is no longer with us, a study that was published in 1954. And this rat has an electrode deep into his brain, through which the scientists who worked with this rat could give him little electrical charges to activate the area of the brain that the electrode landed in. Because those scientists were trying to figure out, what do different parts of the rat brain do? And if we activate different areas, maybe we can learn what this area of the brain does. And so when they had the electrode in, they would stimulate the rat's brain. And they noticed something kind of funny. It was like the rat liked to have that part of the brain stimulated. So wherever it was in the cage when it got the last shock, it would just kind of hunker down in that part of the cage like it was waiting for the next shock. So the researchers said, well, what if we can train the rat to do things in order to get a shock? And so pretty soon they were able to get the rat to move a little bit to its left to get a shock, and then they could move it around like they had a joystick in the rat's brain. The rat seemed to really, really love having this area of the brain activated. So then the researchers said, well, I wonder if we could get the rat to work to activate this area of the brain. How much does the rat like this? And so that's where they came up with this contraption. The rat can press this lever to give himself a shock in this area of the brain. And what the researchers found was that this rat would just press this lever all day long, all night long. It would refuse food and sex and sleep just to stimulate this area of the brain. And so the researchers decided this must be the happiness center of the brain. This must be the pleasure center of the brain. Nothing else could explain this rat's behavior. In fact, they even found that the rat would be willing to run across an electrified grid in its bare little feet and actually burn its feet in order to get to the other side of the cage where it could receive a shock. And that the rat would actually run back and forth across this grid until its feet were so charred and bloody that it had to be taken out of the cage and cared for. Okay, so the researchers thought this has to be the bliss center of the brain. There's nothing else that could explain this type of behavior. But I wonder when I look at the videos of this rat, is this rat actually happy, or is the rat suffering? And to answer that question, it took another decade where researchers decided to put this kind of electrode in a human brain and gave humans the opportunity to give themselves activation in this area of the brain whenever they wanted. And humans acted a lot like the rats. They would just keep on stimulating this area of the brain over and over again. And they did say they liked it, and they really did not want it to stop. So if the psychiatrist would try to take away the little box, the patients would panic and say, no, don't take away my box. I need to keep giving myself this stimulation. But when you ask them, well, are you happy? Does it make you feel good? They actually started saying things like they were really frustrated, and they felt like something really good was coming, but they could never get satisfaction. And they actually seemed kind of anxious and out of it, totally distracted and uninterested in anything. And like the rats, they would refuse food, and they didn't want to do anything except give themselves this electric shock. And what we now know from further investigation of this area of the brain is that what they were experiencing and what the rat was probably experiencing was the promise of happiness or the promise of reward. That when this area of the brain becomes activated, the brain believes something good is going to happen. And that belief, that anticipation is so strong, you are willing to do anything to get that promised happiness. This is one of the biggest mistakes that we make that can lead to our own willpower challenges. That we mistake the inner experience of desire or the inner experience of wanting for the experience of happiness. And what neuroscientists now know is that actually this area of the brain that the rats were stimulating and the human patients were stimulating is the area of the brain that is activated by all the things that we tend to get addicted to. Things like reality TV and drugs and cigarettes and food, Krispy Kreme donuts and wine, our internet devices, everything that we feel like, oh, just one more and then it'll be enough, but it never is enough. It's basically things that are activating this area of the brain that the rats were self-stimulating and humans were self-stimulating. And it turns out that one of the best ways to break free of any addiction, whether it's to food or to a substance or to shopping or to gambling, is to actually learn to distinguish the inner experience of desire, which is actually quite stressful, and the experience of happiness or satisfaction. And whether it's with new drugs that are helping change the system of the brain, or whether it's techniques like mindfulness meditation that is teaching people how to tune in to the huge gap between wanting and actual happiness. This is one of the most promising areas of research in the science of willpower. Okay, so the second myth that I'd like you to consider is this idea many of us have that willpower is a measure of our virtue. That when we are resisting temptation and we're being very focused and we're getting things done, that somehow that's because we're a good person or we're being good. And that when we give in to temptation, when we procrastinate, that we are being bad. And we tend to label our own behaviors, good and bad, virtuous and vice, or even sin. And we rarely think about willpower as actually just being the ability to do what really matters to us, what we really want in the long term. Those choices that are consistent with our long-term goals and values. And one of the most exciting areas to come out of the science of willpower over the last decade is this idea that willpower is really most accurately thought of as a muscle, a kind of literal strength that the brain and the body need to work together to help you remember your goals, focus your attention, override impulses, manage stress in the brain and in the body, and that this is a sort of a characteristic and fixed response of the brain and body, and your brain and body get better at it when you practice it. Just like if you were to practice lifting heavy weights, you would get better at lifting heavy weights, and then you could lift heavier and heavier things without getting tired and without having to give up. And it turns out that this is truly the best way to think about willpower, whether you're looking for the willpower to break a bad habit or reach your goals or even just kind of become a better version of yourself. That the way to do it is to train and to be willing to do things that are quite difficult and even uncomfortable, knowing that each step you take is teaching the brain and the body how to exert self-control. And it turns out that even really small willpower workouts can teach the brain and body how to control much bigger and more difficult impulses and challenges. For example, one of my favorite studies asked adults who were in a romantic relationship to control what they did with their dominant and non-dominant hand. So you can imagine for 2 weeks having to open doors with your non-dominant hand instead of your dominant hand. And that simple training of having to pay attention to what you're doing and remembering what your goals are, that simple training made those adults less likely to abuse their romantic partners. That there was something about just training, paying attention, and regulating impulses to something that seems almost irrelevant to the things we care about. You know, what hand you use to open doors. But that training, that basic process, is giving them more self-control for something I think we all would agree is a very important willpower challenge. And study after study shows this type of thing, that when you commit to doing one thing, whether it's training to run a half marathon, or learning to meditate, or even just improving your posture, that small changes that require you to practice awareness and remembering what your goal is actually make it easier to accomplish much bigger challenges. So the third mistake that many of us make, and is the one that I found is actually the hardest for people to give up, is the idea that you can use guilt and shame as a motivation. That when you feel bad about something you've done, the best way to make sure you don't do it again is to beat yourself up for doing it. You're stupid, you're lazy, what's wrong with you? And you can actually think that may be a reasonable hypothesis, and scientists have looked at this. For example, researchers have looked at people who have problems with drinking and tracked their drinking over time and how bad they felt the morning after they drank too much. And you could guess, maybe the worse they feel, sort of the guiltier they are, the more ashamed they are, the more motivated they will be to not drink again. Or you could guess that the guiltier and more ashamed they feel, the more they're going to need to drink right away. And that actually turns out to be the truth. And not just for people who have issues with drinking, but for dieters who break their diet and then go on to binge eat if they're feeling really guilty and ashamed. Or people who are feeling very guilty and ashamed about their debt, and so they go out and spend money to try to make themselves feel better. Because the things that we tend to feel the most guilty and ashamed about are the things that we actually turn to for comfort or to soothe our own stress. And so when we try to use guilt or shame as some kind of motivation to change our behavior, it doesn't work for the one thing that we feel most guilty and ashamed about. There's a whole new science evolving with self-compassion that shows that when you forgive yourself for a setback, whether it's procrastinating or breaking a resolution or yelling at your kids, the faster you can forgive yourself, the faster you can remember your goal, and the more likely people are to succeed at a change. In fact, just learning a one-day self-compassion training for people who have struggled with binge eating their whole lives, one-day self-compassion training tripled the long-term success rate that group had in losing weight over the course of a year compared to people who were using the same old strategies of basically beating themselves up for not yet being perfect. The fourth myth and big misunderstanding that we have about willpower is the idea that we need to change what's going on inside of us before we can make a real lasting change in our actions and our behavior. Things like guilt and anger and anxiety and confusion. If you imagine someone who's procrastinating because they're feeling really anxious about the thing that they're putting off, many of us would think, well, I gotta fix that anxiety first. I need to work on it, I need to soothe it, I need to get rid of it, and then I'll be able to tackle the thing that I'm afraid of. Or the smoker who's waiting to stop needing nicotine in order to quit. Or the person who's gonna start exercising as soon as they stop hating exercising. Like, I'll do it when it's easy. And many of us can spend a lot of time trying to fix these inner experiences, but the science now is suggesting that the more you try to fix your inner experiences, to push anxiety away so you can do what you're afraid of, or to deny the cravings that you have as sort of a form of self-control, the more you resist your inner experiences, the stronger they get. And the only way to actually transform inner experiences like cravings or anxiety, other emotions and stress, is a kind of jujitsu. It's kind of a paradox. You actually have to accept them and focus on changing your behavior first. So the procrastinator needs to take a step, needs to take an action, and allow herself to feel the anxiety while she does it. The smoker needs to learn how to tolerate the distress of withdrawal or cravings and not feel like I can't handle this inner experience, if this is too intense or too much for me. And so there's a whole new area of interventions that are simply teaching people how to handle the distress that they feel when they contemplate making a difficult change, whether it's the physiological distress of a craving or the emotional distress of self-doubt or anxiety or anger. And the more people accept those inner experiences and focus on their outer actions, the more they are likely to actually transform those inner experiences over time. And the last misunderstanding is actually the reason why I teach a class called The Science of Willpower, and why I wrote a book about the science of willpower, is that most of us, when we think about our own willpower challenges, we focus on what we think it says about what is uniquely broken and wrong with us. And we will use our willpower challenges, whether we struggle with procrastination or addiction or temptation, or we just feel like we have let down ourselves or others by not fully realizing our potential. We think that says something that is uniquely wrong with us. And what the science says is actually this is all of this, the temptation, the addiction, procrastination, all of this says that you live in a human body and you have a human brain and you have all of these different aspects of human nature that will make you want and will make you. And that comes along with also everything that we need in order to make positive changes. The anxiety comes along with the courage, and the distraction comes along with the focus, and that we have all of this. And so that when you're struggling, you can come to appreciate that it's not just you, it's all of us. And we can really move beyond this kind of myopic focus on using our willpower challenges to beat ourselves up, and really shift the focus to figuring out how we can support ourselves and each other in reaching our goals. And so this kind of comes back to the initial point I made, which is that one of the best things about science and starting to investigate the science is that it can be a very rich source of self-compassion and common humanity. And so I just want to invite you to consider thinking about turning to science, not just for the solutions to make all of our problems go away, but actually a very rich resource of inspiration and connection with others. Thank you.